Can any good come out of this? Suffering, by definition, is an unpleasant experience. We suffer for various reasons: physical illness, pain, grief, loneliness, self-doubt, troubled relationships, fear, economic injustice, violence, brushes with death, depression, and so on. No one wants to endure any of these things. We avoid them if at all possible. When they come, we often ask, how can I be honest to God about this? Or we ask, do I deserve this? Or we cry out in puzzlement, where is God's will in this? There is yet another biblical perspective, another possible way of making meaning out of suffering. Perhaps, though it seems awful, our suffering may actually be a blessing in disguise, an experience that will do us some good or bring some good to others. Is it possible that something that looks so evil to the sufferer might actually be the vehicle for some greater good? Can any good come out of this? There are places in the Bible that suggest we may actually become better persons through the experience of suffering. Eliphaz tells Job that he ought not to despise the chastening of the Almighty, because the one whom God reproves will be happy. I haven't experienced that too many times. The letter to the Hebrews reminds us that God sometimes disciplines us just as a parent disciplines children. In his letter to the Romans, St. Paul tells us that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope, and hope does not disappoint us. Sometimes people can actually say, thanks, God, I needed my bell to be rung. Thanks for turning me around, helping me see what's truly important, getting my priorities straight, making me humble and dependent on you. The end of the Joseph narrative is a lovely illustration of how the suffering of one person, Joseph, can actually lead to the greater good of others. The patriarch Jacob has died, and the brothers are afraid that Joseph will punish them for the evil they did to him earlier in the story. But Joseph forgives them. He tells them that they meant to do him evil, but God meant it for good in order that many people would be saved at the time of famine. Joseph did not deserve to suffer the pain of being dragged away from home into slavery within a foreign country. That was an evil thing that his brothers did to him. God did not plan it or push them into it. They did it on their own. Siblings are up to such things. Maybe not to that extreme. But once they had done this harm to Joseph, God continued to work in the mix of the situation, making something good eventually to come out of it. Because Joseph ended up in Egypt, many people were saved. An evil deed and great suffering on the part of Joseph became the means to something ultimately good. Good can come out of situations that seem terrible and without any foreseeable redeeming value. Now, it is important to point out that this view is an advance over a narrow view of retribution that tries to identify every example of suffering as the result of some kind of specific sin. And it diverts our attention away from the cause of the suffering and tries to focus our attention on the future. Where do we go from here? Can some good come out of this awful mess that we are in? No matter what caused it, our own sins, God's doing, the freedom of other human beings to hurt us, just plain old bad luck, there is the possibility that God can use it for some greater good. God is still working in and with God's creation. At the moment of suffering, it is impossible and even cruel to ascertain how such unpleasantness could ever lead to anything good. A sufferer will probably be angry if you even suggest such a possibility. I think of the times in my growing up when I was in pain or wiped out on my bicycle, the last thing I wanted to hear right at the point of the accident was, yeah, something good will come out of that. As Joseph was being dragged off from his home and family to faraway Egypt, there was no way that he could have known that someday many would be saved because the jealousy of his brothers made it possible for him to be exiled into such a strategic geopolitical spot. Only at the end of many years, as he looked back over an intricate chain of events, was Joseph able to see God's hand in all of this and realize that something had been gained because of his suffering. Hindsight is a wonderful thing. The old adage, it's 20/20. The farther we are removed from our suffering, maybe the more likely we are to accept the possibility that good can come from it. This has been the testimony of countless Christians who have been convinced that they were better people and could be better helpers to other people because of their own experience of suffering. Think about your friends who have suffered through a particular illness, cancer, for example, and what it means for someone who has suffered through cancer and cancer treatment to be able to be at the side of another person who is experiencing that. Yes, there may be hindsight value that comes from our suffering. Many believers have attested to that, but it does not always happen. Sometimes the suffering is so severe that there seems to be no redeeming value, even with years of hindsight and an impassioned desire to find meaning. Think of the Holocaust, for example. Not all suffering will yield a positive answer to the question, can any good come out of this? Sometimes the mystery remains. Perhaps the way of reflecting about meaning and suffering can shed some light on how we think about Jesus' own crucifixion. The suffering of Jesus, hanging there in great pain, dying the death of a criminal, being humiliated by every passing observer, was a terrible, awful thing. How could any good have ever come out of such an event? It was an awful example of what human beings are like, and systems, the kind of evil they do to one another, the rejection of even the one who comes with perfect love to the world, the one whom God sent. You would think that would be just one more condemnation of the rotten world in which we live, and a reminder that we are all sinners who deserve the death penalty too. But the crucifixion is not the end. That most awful of events becomes the means of salvation, the way God chose to reach out to the world and save it. That God actually shows up in the places in the world where we least expect. Though human beings just as Joseph's brothers meant to do evil to him, but God worked good out of it eventually. At the moment of his death, Jesus' followers could see no value in this. Most of his followers just flew the coop. Peter denied the relationship with Jesus in the heat of the persecution. It seemed like the dead end. They scattered in fear and disillusionment. The promise was destroyed, they thought. It was only with hindsight, after the resurrection, after they knew they were forgiven and that death had lost its sting, that they were able to see that Jesus' death had redeeming value for them. He died for them, and by his blood they were saved. That most awful of days is now called Good Friday, and we wear the cross around our necks and hang it front and center in our churches. God can make good come out of suffering. It does not matter where the suffering comes from, out of our own doing, or the evil deeds of others, or some hidden mystery. The important point, brothers and sisters, is that God does not abandon us in our suffering. There is nothing that can happen to us, to our loved ones, or to our world that is so bad that it can separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus, our Lord. And so, in the words of the Canadian theologian Douglas John Hall, faith confesses that God is able and willing, using the raw stuff of our deeds and misdeeds,